I have this, opportunity to speak about things that I'm really interested in. And as you already know, I was speaking about Soviet logos. So Soviet logos started as a personal project, first of all. I'm not really sure if any of you follows the project, but it's on Instagram, and this was the primary idea of this project, is simply to post logos that I found and to make them available for people in the former Soviet states, as well as the people from the West, from the enemies of the Soviet Union, the capitalists, because they were, even now, there's very little information about what this Soviet logo. But instead of talking about the project itself, I'd like to look at this presentation from this perspective. So the full name of my presentation is Soviet Logos, Lost Marks of Utopia. So you might ask why I call them lost marks, and this is where we have some statistics, official statistics from one of the organizations, and it says that until 1st of January 1975 there were more than 18,000 trademarks registered in the State Registry of Trademarks of the Soviet Union. And this is only until 1975. The Soviet Union lasted for almost extra 20 years, and during that time even more trademarks were created. But today, most of them remain forgotten, and they forgotten not only here, but they're basically unknown in the Western countries. So this essentially made me think that the whole idea of this project should be to gather, publish, and recontextualize Soviet logos so they are part of global design contexts. So I think it would make sense to start from the history of the Soviet logo. And I like to separate this whole era of Soviet logos into three distinctive parts, which were actually quite a lot determined by the leaders of the Soviet Union. So the first era, the very beginning of Soviet Union, where Lenin was in charge, was actually determined by this very bold and revolutionary style of constructivist and other avant-garde artists. And since a logo is always a part of economical world and the world of visual culture, it means that it's always a product of the both sides. So if we take a look at the logos created in that particular era, the era of Soviet genesis, we'll see that logos of that time followed this bold constructivist visual aesthetics that were essentially laid by such masters as Alexander Rodchenko, Sutkайтис, Lyubov Popov, and others. And in this particular slide we see a logo for Dobrolyot. It's the Russian Society of Voluntary Air Fleet, and it was designed by Rodchenko itself, which is quite amazing, because Rodchenko essentially wasn't really a logo designer. Then comes the era of Stalin, and this era is quite heavily determined by economical process of those times, because during the 50s and 40s, Soviet economy was mostly focused on rebuilding what was destroyed during the war. So this, in this era, basically very little logos were actually created, and those who were created were actually not really similar to what we call a logo today. In this example, we see I would call it an emblem for all Union Research Institute of Peat Industry. And if we look at this from this visual perspective, we'll understand that these ideas of avant-garde artists, of Rodchenko, Sovetskие, and so on, were very quickly forgotten, and this style of social realism is quite prominent during that era. But everything changes when Nikita Khrushchev came to power, and we all know that with his arrival, a lot of things changed in the Soviet Union. So this meant that Nikita Khrushchev changes also touched the economical aspect. So the amount of consumer products started to get bigger and bigger, because Nikita Khrushchev understood that in order to make the Soviet people happy, he has to produce more consumer products, which was basically never done under the regime of Stalin or Lenin. And here we see this decree from Soviet Council of Ministers, which is called about trademarks, о товарных знаках. And what it basically means is that I like to call this date the boom of Soviet logos, because this particular document determined what is a trademark, when it should be designed, and how it should be registered. So after this date, thousands and thousands of Soviet trademarks had to be designed, because the decree actually said that every Soviet organization, no matter its size, no matter its type, should have a registered trademark. And this essentially meant that in the 60s and 70s, literally thousands of trademarks were designed. And this is quite unique in the sense of global design context. And again, if we'll take a look at the visual form of those logos, they clearly follow the global design context. They are based on modernism, they are built on very clear geometric forms, and of course they are representing the remodernized Soviet Union. Another very interesting aspect of Soviet logos is who were the designers behind them and what institutions participated in this creative area. So I like to compare this area of logos as a mixture of professionalism and kultura. It's a lovely Russian word actually, and it's quite hard to translate it properly to Lithuanian. Well, in Lithuanian we actually use kultura as well, but in English it's sort of, it could be translated like hack work. So why I used those words? So after the Second World War in the Western world, a lot of different graphic design agencies started to emerge, and some of them were actually quite specialized, meaning that they were mostly designing corporate identities and logos. But what happened in the Soviet Union is that even though there were a lot of different graphic design institutions, or let's say design institutions, none of them was actually specialized in this particular area of logo design. And here we see a very small list of some of the organizations. For example, Vinita, which is probably the most famous one, was originally created as industrial design institution. SKHKB was devised as fashion technology bureau. The same is for MKB, which is acronym for Experimental Artistic Construction Bureau, which was created to design packaging. So basically, what this shows that all of these institutions actually created logos, but none of them were specialized in this field. And this was mostly determined by how design works were distributed in those graphic design institutions. Well, not everyone, not every, but pretty much the majority of Soviet logos were created as parts of contests. So even if we today hate logo contests, back then it was quite usual to organize them. And in this particular example, we see a request from a factory. It's Panevėžys glass factory, and this request basically asks Advertising Bureau of Vilnius to create a trademark project as well as some other corporate identity things like diploma, corporate envelope, and stuff like that. So when a graphic design institution received such a request, it would then launch internal design contest in which pretty much everyone who was part of that institution could participate. And that was no matter whether you were an engineer, an architect, typographer, packaging designer. So yeah. And this is why I actually call this, not very nicely, but a sort of cultura, because even though logos were created by true professionals of their fields, like architects or typographers, none of them consider themselves to be logo designers completely, because logo design never paid their rents. It was some, money that they got from a site. But that money was actually quite big. Usual price for a trademark varied around 250 rubles, compared to the average wage of a civil servant, which was around 150 rubles. Rewards were quite a bonus for the artists. So if you were freer, you have some free time, you could participate in such contest and win quite a lot of money. Okay, so we are moving further, and I think it would be interesting to talk about the function, the purpose of a Soviet logo. And well, so logos were introduced in Soviet Union as parts of design and advertising, which was essentially things that came from the capitalistic system. So in order to make logos work in a socialist environment, they had to introduce such transformation of functions. Basically, they have to think of ways how a logo, advertising, or design in general would work in socialist environment. And one of the initial ideas, initial functions of a logo was logo had to work as a trademark, so to say, as an identificational element that had to distinguish products from each other. But we can't really properly evaluate this function without trying to understand what was the material environment of those times. Because in the constant appearance of deficit, where there was constant lack of even the most rudimentary products, some of the products became trademarked themselves. They got this legendary status that didn't really need to have any sort of identification. And I always like to imagine this situation as if myself came to this Univermag and like I wanted to buy a pair of shoes. So unlike in the West, where I would usually be able to choose from crazy amounts of sneakers by Puma, Adidas, and so on, in the Soviet Union, I was lucky if I got one pair of shoes and they were the color I wanted. So how did this identificational function of a logo actually work in such an environment? And this identificational function was also quite eliminated by the overall economic model of Soviet Union, because pretty much everything from the distribution of products to its production was held by one pair of hands. So there was no real need to compete with your rivals, because essentially the success of a factory, let's say, was determined not so much by the amount of sold production, but by the amount of produced production. So that's how it worked. Another interesting function proposed by the Soviets was a logo as a standard of quality. So logo had to work as an obligation of quality that makes people confident about the product they buy. And this is what the Soviet theorists proposed. A manufacturer, by placing his mark on a product, takes full responsibility for its quality and is obligated to supply a consumer with only high quality products. So this was of course the ideal scenario. But the problem is that logos were used on all sorts of products regardless of their actual quality. And this meant that if a consumer is unable to choose a product of a better quality, the value of quality essentially is almost nullified. And this is very clearly seen in this slide. On the top row, we see 3 logos. I rated them basically completely according to the initial ideas of the authors. And on the bottom row, we see how those logos were reproduced by the Soviet industry. So, and these are actually quite okay examples. I found really more terrible examples where logos are so distorted that it's basically hard to say whether it's the same logo as the author intended. And we can see in those examples that lines so carefully drawn by all sorts of professionals, usually those logos had those calculated grids with crazy radius calculation and stuff like that. But during the industrial production, those logos were so distorted that this idea of mark as obligation of quality was basically eliminated. Also, the third function of a logo was that it had to work as a sort of advertising. The Soviet theorists thought that logo should have this promotional effect. So it basically meant that logos should make people buy things. And this is where this very obvious contradiction comes in, this very obvious conflict. Advertising essentially stimulates consumerism. And this is what the Soviets thought about consumers. Consumers is the city-dwelling bourgeois aim to be better than others. So, you know, consumers was considered as pure evil. So once again, Soviets had to find a way of how to solve this conflict. So what they did is that they hid this promotional consumer side of advertising under educational role. So the Soviets said that Soviet advertising, unlike the examples in the West, instead of trying to sell no matter what kind of product to the customer, had to work as this channel of objective information. But obviously this didn't really work, as advertising was still advertising, and Soviet advertising worked in the same ways, though not as effectively as the capitalistic advertising. Sometimes this promotional effect, this advertising effect, was actually completed by using associative logos. So what is associative logo? Is basically a logo that clearly indicates the type of production, let's say, a factory produces. So in those 2 examples, we see that the one on the left is definitely a logo for a juice factory, because we can see a glass and some sort of fruit. While on the right we see, well, a silhouette of book, and this, of course, instantly makes us think that this is some sort of publishing house. But then we need to understand that very big part of Soviet industrial organizations were participating in creation of very large amount of different products. And this was actually quite obvious in plastic industry, where, for example, a factory could produce toys, plumbing equipment, building materials, and each of those different products were actually marked by the same symbol. So while in the West, this would be solved by dividing products into brands. In Soviet Union, there was no such idea of a brand, and logos were simply used without trying to understand the audience to which it should be sold. And here's a video, hope it plays. It's quite an interesting example of video Soviet advertising.
Ну что, тяжело? А собственно, зачем вы осложняете себе жизнь? Магазин «Салон Энергия» берет на себя все заботы по доставке холодильников и наборов кухонной мебели в ваши квартиры.
So I'm sure that you'd like to buy a refrigerator now. Okay, and this is perhaps the most interesting aspect of Soviet logos, because when I speak with people about this, about Soviet logos phenomena, they are so interested to hear how this connection between Soviet ideology, socialist ideology, was actually working in case of logos. So, graphic design from pretty much of the inception of the Soviet Union worked as a channel of official doctrine. So basically it was used for propaganda, and Soviet person could be met by this propaganda pretty much in every aspect of his life, whether he was going to a kindergarten or whether he was participating in construction of some sort of building. But what is really interesting is that graphic design that was meant for this commercial use was actually quite free from those visual symbols of the Soviet regime. And this is even more interesting if we take a look at those two logos. As we can see, both of those logos are created for Soviet organizations that carries this very Soviet-like name. So, in example of the shoe factory, it is named after Red October, while on the collective farm, in the collective farm case, it is named after Vladimir Lenin. So, if we heard such names, we would usually expect the logos to carry some sort of visual iconography of socialist regime. But it seems that logos were sort of free of this ideology, because in none of these logos we see any clear reflections of the Soviet regime. So this naturally makes us think that Soviet logos was sort of a romantic creative area where artists could do pretty much what they wanted to do. And in some cases it's actually true, because if we take a look at most of the logos that I already showed, none of them has this iconography. But the thing is that we can't really distinguish Soviet ideology from Soviet logos, because essentially logos were created in the system of Soviets. And no matter what was the original purpose of a logo, essentially it served the people's economy first, so to say, the state itself. And this is quite obvious in these examples, where we can see a May Day demonstration from Estonian SSR, where workers of Pärnu fishery are participating. And even the logo is not really telling us anything about the Soviet Union and its ideas. It's still participating in this communist environment. This is another example, actually from my hometown, for a sugar factory. And once again, we see that the truck is emblazoned with all sorts of slogans saying glory to the Communist Party and stuff like that. But as someone commented on my Instagram, this logo could be used for KFC burgers. So, you know, there's this interesting contradiction. Soviet logos also got this ideological charge through usage of corporate style or visual identity. So, corporate style reached the Soviet Union quite late. but its elements were the same as the elements of capitalistic corporate style. So it had such things as logo, corporate typeface, corporate colors, some basic logo usage rules. But what really differed is the essential function of a corporate style. Unlike in the West, where corporate style was actually used to distinguish unique private business from each other, in the Soviet Union, corporate style was used for this internal usage, meaning that instead of being used to sell production, it was used to unite workers of an organization. And logo, being the main part of this corporate style, was used pretty much everywhere in Soviet organizations, from small animal pins to diplomas, posters, grand factory buildings. So essentially this constant repetition of logos had to work as what they call local propaganda. It had to unify workers to complete this collective work. And in some cases it actually worked, because some organizations managed to reach this, global, to reach this level where they were considered as prestigious places to work in. But this was also sometimes nullified by the thing called illegal economical practices. So it's a fancy, word, but what it means that because of the constant shortages of all sorts of products, resources, and sometimes even food, it meant that those illegal economical practices started to emerge. And one of such practices was called combination, which is basically stealing from your organization or workplace and then reselling the resources or the products you stole in the black market. So this was sort of justified thing, and as we can see from a quote from one of the Soviet workers, he said that they did not consider it a theft. We are the state, so we'll take what we need. So this nice idea of a corporate style to unify workers for this collective goal was sometimes eliminated by people's need to live better. And the logo, being the main part of this corporate style, worked in an environment that usually represented the workplace not as a prestigious organization, but rather as a system of the same, rather as a part of the same system that can be used for your own needs. And this is another area of Soviet logos that people are usually very interested in. They are interested to see whether Soviet logos were actually copies of what was done in the West. And I'm actually against this idea that the logos designed by the Soviet authors were actually copies. But once again, if we take a look at all of the logos that I already showed and the ones that are here, we'll notice that they didn't really differ from the logos that are created today. So I made this game. I know that you guys here in Russia has this interesting show called Bitva Ekstrasensov. And since it's really hard to determine which logo is Western or capitalistic and which is not, I'd like to have a volunteer who could help me to say which logo is Soviet and which is not. Do I have someone? Do I have the ultimate extra sense? Okay, so if nobody wants to join, you can all do this in your heads. Just try to look at those and just try to say which is Soviet and which is not. I just give you a couple of seconds. We'll see. We'll see. Okay, so have you decided, or do you need some more time? Okay, so take a look, and here we go. The reds are the Soviets, the blues are for the capitalistic countries. Did anyone got everything right? Because if you got it right, you are a liar. Because even I spent massive amounts of time looking at those logos, redrawing them, digging through all sorts of archives. And even if I see a logo without any context, without the name of the factory and other details that hint if it was Soviet, I can't really determine if it was Soviet or not. Another interesting aspect of the Soviet logos that, in sense, they were westernized, not so much directly by the West, but by the other socialist countries that were socialist countries such as Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, that were relatively closer to the West and received those modernist ideas a bit earlier. So here we see a selection of 3 logos. Once again, I'm not really trying to say that Soviet or socialist designers copied the Western one. I'm just trying to say that we can very clearly see how this modernist idea moved through countries and through periods and essentially reached the Soviet Union. So while it was late, it basically meant that Soviet logos, even with some hiccups, managed to reach this global design level. And there are some more examples that I'd like to show. When I posted logo for Mokslas publishing house, Mokslas in Lithuanian means science, there were a lot of comments that this is basically a copy of Motorola logo. But when analyzing logos, always like to take a deeper look to what kind of environment they were created in. So in this case, we need to understand that both of the logos are for organizations that are dealing with future, high-tech, space exploration, and stuff like that. So Motorola logo was essentially created as a mark for this futuristic company that was dealing with all sorts of futuristic communications equipment, while Mokslas Publishing House was created to publish the advances of Soviet science. So even if those logos are very similar to each other, essentially they represent the futuristic ideas that were only prominent in their own era. And this is what I meant. So the Motorola logo, even if it was designed earlier, is following this idea of cookie architecture, Reagan Gothic style. So these are just the fancy words for futurist architecture that was very common during 50s and 60s in America. And this architecture was, defined by very expressive forms that resembles the logo of Motorola, while the Mokslas mark reflects the futuristic ideas of another era of Soviet space age, Sputniks and rockets. And I wanted to compare this with the monument in Moscow, the space exploration monument, if I'm correct. And we can see that both the monument and the logo are based on the same visual ideas. They follow this extreme verticality. They have this pronounced elliptical forms and a combination of sharp and soft shapes. And there are more examples that resemble the Western designs. But for example, in this particular example, the logo from the Soviet factory is actually older than the one for the International Film Festival. So then we can ask who copied who. But again, since every logo was built on this modernist ideas, and as a graphic designer myself, I know that it's really easy to draw something similar by, creating in this environment of modernist simplicity, minimalism, and stuff like that. Once again, some more examples. It's really hard to tell whether it's copied or not, even if we, take a look at the days they were created. I'm pretty sure it wouldn't really prove anything. And this is, of course, the best one. It's for the Soviet one is for restaurant, while the other one is for Internet Explorer. So what I wanted to say with all of those Soviet logo examples, that even if they resemble the Western examples quite a lot, it essentially means that they are not really copies, but more as part of the same global design context. And by saying that, I feel quite sad, because the capitalistic logos are so prominent and so visible in this design history context, as I have literally hundreds of design albums that has collections of logos created in capitalistic countries. But almost none of these albums has any trademarks designed in the Soviet Union. So the essential idea of this project is to basically try, as I mentioned, just to try to find these trademarks once again, and to make them public and available. And we are moving towards the end, and I would like to say a couple of words on how those logos managed to survive until today. So a very small part of logos survive until today, and even smaller part of those logos are used by modern organizations. But those trademarks that managed to survive this radical change in economy, radical changes in social and cultural fabric of societies, very quickly took the roles delegated by the new era, the era of capitalism. And I think that, unlike most of the Soviet relics that can be still seen today, Soviet logos are, in a sense, more modern and suitable for today because of their universal graphical language. And I think that this is further accentuates this idea of utopian Soviet logo. Because if we take a few steps back, we'll see that essentially logo was designed as a part of a Soviet system. It had to serve the needs of the state. But when the system changed, it quickly took the roles delegated by the new era. And it basically means that, I forgot what I wanted to say. Yeah, so logos that were created for the Soviet system today actually reflect the system not as a land of superiority, but rather as a land of unfulfilled promises and utopia. And in this last image we see Centralny Univermag in, I can't remember which Ukrainian town it is, but we can see that the logo, which just zoom, was designed in the 70s, and it's still very nicely incorporated into the capitalistic advertising of our era. So that's it. Thanks so much for your attention, and I really hope that you like the whole presentation. And of course, if you have any questions, really feel free to ask. There's a lot of things to be said. I just tried to keep this presentation quite laconic in order not to get it very large. So if you have any questions, you can either ask now or catch me somewhere around here. And
thank you very much. As far as I understood, there was very little information about the Soviet logos while you were doing your work. I'm just interested, where were you looking for it for example, now, and whether you are planning to publish a book or somehow to make this kind of investigation open for the public, because it's really a cool theme, and it's quite, you're quite right, it's very closed. There's very little information about it.
Thanks a lot for your question. It's a very good question, and when I started the project, I didn't know where to look for this information, and it felt that there is no information, like everything is lost. But once you get into this topic more and more, you start seeing that this information is all around. You just need to know where to look. So what started as purely this Instagram project, where I just was posting visual images without any context and understanding why and how they were designed, this turned into a larger project that, since you were asked about the book, it is actually being printed at this very moment and should be available at any time. So yeah. Any more questions? Okay. So again, if you have any questions or just want to chat, I'll be around here, and thank you very much.